metadata for this video. Welcome to this replay of the launch event for the Centre for Research on Education in a Digital Society, CREDS, on Truth, Trust and Knowing Through the Pandemic, the Digital Learning Challenge. Thanks for watching, and before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, upon whose ancestral lands our city campus now stands, and indeed where both the event and where I am now at home are. I pay respect to their elders, both past and present, acknowledging them as the traditional custodians of knowledge for this land. If you'd like to find out more about CREDS, you can follow us on Twitter and go to our website, and I'll share the links for that in the metadata for this video. I'm Dr. Simon Knight, and it's my enormous privilege to welcome you tonight to the launch of CREDS as its director. Understanding how people learn, people's learning needs for full participation in society, and the learning challenges that people may encounter, all mediated by technologies that we learn through and with. This is one of the most pressing issues of our time. To give a rundown of what we're going to be doing today, we are recording, and we'll be sharing the recording after the session. The recording will only capture the CREDS speakers' audio and video, and whatever's put into the chat. We might ask later if we can take a gallery screenshot, and at that point, if you want to turn your camera on or off, then of course you're very welcome to do so. We'd just love to have a capture of who's come along today. So tonight I'm going to give a brief introduction to the centre before handing it over to our panel. And I hope that we'll also hear from you via the chat function, which you'll see at the bottom of your screen with a little chat icon, with any burning questions that you have around the issues that we're discussing, resources you want to share, and so on. We'll be particularly monitoring that over the panel component and try and capture the key questions that people are flagging, but do feel free to share things as we go along as well. The Centre for Research on Education in a Digital Society has a dual focus. We investigate the dynamic relationship between technology and learning, reflecting that how we learn with technology is fundamentally intertwined with what we learn about technology. This research spans a range of strands, from modelling the changes in learning needs and developing methods for interrogating technologies, investigating new forms of literacies and technologies that support their development, particularly around the role of data in society, and the central role that teachers and their own use of technology for professional development play in all of this. Or, in a bit more detail, the research across these strands addresses a range of questions. And just to pick out a few examples from the many, we have research projects that explore how we effectively design for learning with technologies and evaluation methods for this, mining job adverts to understand shifting skills needs and how we match that to learning opportunities, analysis of misinformation in social media communities, Twitter and Facebook, and technologies that can help people to make their thinking and argumentation visible to foster quality dialogue. Data, as I said, plays an increasing role in many aspects of our lives, And we've had projects in this space ranging from investigating teacher use of data and student numeracy skills and how we develop curricula for that, and the investigation of tools, including simulation and extended reality tools to develop data literacy for understanding the world around us. In the digital teacher strands, we've had projects that investigate teachers' skillful use of technologies like mobile devices to support students in their STEM learning, and the use of these devices to support their own professional learning networks and professional development. The centre members just about fit on one slide, which was very convenient for me. We have 16 members and associates and a number of honoraries, and there are at least 13 PhD students, HDR students in this space in the faculty as well. And we span a range of faculties. So we're a centre that is championed out of the Faculty of Arts and Social Sciences, but we're a cross-institution centre with a shared interest in understanding the interrelationships of learning and technology and their role in tackling global challenges. So we have members from the School of Education and International Studies, particularly well represented, drawing on their expertise in the school system and teacher education, alongside colleagues in communications, science, engineering and IT, the Kinetic Intelligence Centre, and my own faculty, the Transdisciplinary School. And I anticipate us bringing more people in over the coming year. In fact, I know this represents the centre, I'm particularly grateful to Peter and Sandy, Professors Orbison and Schuck, for their work on predecessor STEM Education Futures Centre, from which CREDS has emerged, and actually also just for their wider collaborations with many of the centre members. And I'm also really grateful to the many members who've helped to shape UTS's work in this space and really laid the grounding for us being able to coalesce as a centre. I'm also really grateful to our many external partners. And again, I'm just going to pick some very brief examples. There is a bit of an overview. But in the data and digital literacy space, we've had work, for example, with government around maths transition from schools into universities, with Facebook and UNESCO understanding information sharing in online communities. We've had a range of different projects across schools and companies that have looked at how people make subject choices, assessments beyond disciplinary contexts, and organizational literacies in emerging technology areas. Looking at teacher expertise, many of the centre members have worked with New South Wales Department for Education and the range of other state government in that context, as well as other state governments, Association of Independent Schools, and so on, looking at teacher expertise and how we can foster and share that expertise. And we've also had a range of government-funded projects, including the Australian Research Councils here, and schemes like Erasmus in Europe, looking at things like how do we use technologies to foster dialogue in classrooms and beyond. About as far as you can go beyond. At least one of those projects involved NASA some time ago, but there are a range of others in that space too. So we work with stakeholders across a wide range of contexts, and if you're interested in working with us as academic partners, or within your own professional context, then please do get in touch. And our interest is in taking a sociocultural and human-centered approach to understanding technology in practice. So rather than centering technologies, we center learning. And centre members take a critical perspective on technologies, their design and integration, as well as their potential power to foster learning across society and enhance a just and equitable society. The key characterization of the centre, for me at least, is that our expertise addresses how does a learning and technologies lens inform our understanding. And that's across a wide range of challenges and contexts. And that's what we're going to do tonight. We're going to apply those lenses to the particular challenges around issues of credibility and trust through the pandemic and how that's been bound up with technology, thinking about the work across the centre. I'm going to introduce our panel chair and also our the ADR from FASS, Noel, who's going to briefly say some words. And Noel will pass on to Jane, so we'll move straight into the panel from that. So chairing our panel tonight is CREDS member, Associate Professor Jane Hunter. And Jane is an academic in the School of International Studies and Education, SOISI, with a distinguished career as a teacher and leader, and engaged academic, and engaged both in the sense of working with many external partners, looking for impact in our school sector, also engaged more joyfully for me, I suppose, in the sense that we have worked closely together on the panel and the centre, and she's a generous collaborator, and I'm delighted that she is chairing the panel tonight. Before Jane kicks the panel off, I'm going to pass to Professor Noel Castree, the Faculty of Arts and Social Sciences Associate Dean, and he's going to say a few words about the centre's significance at UTS before handing on to Jane. Over to you, Noel.
Thanks, Simon. Good afternoon, everybody. Yeah, look, it's really pleasing to end the year on a positive note with this launch event. CREDS has been a long time in the making. It was conceived over 2 years ago. It evolved, as Simon said, from a previous centre called the STEM Education Futures Centre, and so its foundations were laid before I started in this role in August last year. Obviously, the pandemic has slowed everything down, but here we are. As of this evening, CREDS goes live, so that's really fantastic. And the work that Simon and colleagues intend to do, and indeed are already doing, it does matter within and beyond UTS, and I say that for 2 or 3 reasons. Firstly, it's pretty obvious that today social relationships, cultural identities, people's capacities, people's practices are very deeply technologized. Hardware, software, various electronic gadgets, computational algorithms, big data and so on mediate and govern human activity in very consequential ways. Secondly, what that means is, and again it's quite an obvious point, but it's still important, is that we need not just pure STEM research, but we need socio-technical research that has wide public value, because it attends to how science and technology are, could and should be woven into the social fabric. And I guess thirdly and finally, at UTS, as many of you know, we are pushing cross-faculty, multidisciplinary initiatives pretty hard these days, and with good reason. And so as Simon said, the centre, even though it's anchored in FASS, which is my faculty obviously, it does go beyond the faculty, and Simon symbolises that because as the director he's from the TD school. So I think it's very appropriate that this centre is trying to work across the different barriers between different disciplines. So I'm looking forward to the next 3 to 5 years, Simon, and the CREDS agenda being important and timely, and hopefully yielding some really excellent, impactful research. So best of luck, and hand over to Jane. Thanks.
Hi everyone. Look, thank you so much for that warm introduction, and thank you especially Simon and also Noel. This is a really exciting evening potentially, and it's great to see so many colleagues and former colleagues, and Sandy and Peter especially here, Kimberly, our schools pals, and others. So welcome everyone, and lovely to have not only people from within FASS, but also far beyond, and as well as our external partners. So I'm going to be chairing the panel this evening, and I hope the title of our panel was, yes, you wanted to come to the launch, but also I'm sure you wanted to have a little bit of a sense around, you know, what is trust, truth and knowing in the time of the pandemic. And what have been some of the big digital learning challenges? And we're going to address that question, or guess the topic more broadly, through 4 specific ideas, and I'll come to those in a moment. But I just wanted to introduce you first of all to our panel. So we have, first of all, Associate Professor Matthew Kearney, who is a centre member, and he teaches in the School of International Studies and Education. And of course, he was one of the founding members of the STEM previous incarnation of our centre. His research specialises in technology-mediated learning in school and teacher education contexts, and he's currently a chief investigator on a large ARC discovery grant on optimising mobile learning in maths and science. He's been a very active partner on the big Erasmus projects, and also designing and evaluating innovative mobile pedagogies that was funded through Erasmus. And that's been a really interesting project, which he will touch on briefly, if not this evening, but that you can follow up with that project later with him. So Matthew's work has also drawn high impact from the ARC in 2019. And we were also very happy last Friday when UTS was named the #1 institution out of 250 in the Australian for its research and journal publications in teaching and teacher education. So that was a wonderful accolade to get just on the almost on the eve of the centre launch. It gives me great pleasure to now introduce Dr. Amelia Johns. Now, Amelia is an associate member of our centre. She's a senior lecturer in digital and social media at UTS, but her work spans digital media and citizenship studies. So really interesting areas around, you know, what does it mean to be a participant in democracy and so on. But she's particularly interested in technology mediated learning in school and teacher education contexts. And she is also an investigator on a large ARC project. And it's that particular project that she has money for is, and she'll talk specifically about that in a moment, is fostering global digital citizenship, diasporic youth in a connected world. So Amelia uses primarily digital ethnography in her work. She's done and been recognised for her work with Facebook, which is wonderful. You know, that's a plus or a minus, I guess, in some people's eyes. But it's wonderful to think that people like Amelia there are asking the tough questions in those on those sorts of platforms. So she's very interested in how hate speech is manifested across social media platforms, and I guess for many of us that's a real concern, and so it'll be wonderful to hear from Amelia. And the third member of our panel is a centre member, is Professor Simon Buckingham Shum, who is also the director of one of our very active centres at UTS, the Connected Intelligence Centre, and we've done work for a number of years with that particular centre. Simon specialises in educational data science and human-centred design, and he supported the development of tools that help not only teachers but education leaders and students more broadly, as well as analysts, use not in their own practice, but also to uncover new insights as to their possibilities. So Simon has a long career fascination with the potential of software to make thinking visible, and his work very much sits at the intersection of multidisciplinary fields of human-computer interaction, ed technology, hypertext, and computer-supported collaboration. And in the, very much in the learning analytics or educational data science field. So we have a wonderful panel and really looking forward to their insights. So welcome to all of you. So what I'd like to start by doing is to indicate to our audience that we're really going to have a look at this idea of the needs and uses of technology in a digital society. But how do we actually navigate those ideas around trust, truth, and knowing in a digital era, essentially? But it's also about how does digital learning support data literacy and navigating complexity in a sustainable world. So we need to really look at the practices that teachers use, and I use the term teacher in its broadest possible sense. So we're not only including teachers in schools, but in universities, most definitely, but also instructors in business and tech companies, for example. So how do we actually go about supporting their agency? The first question I'd like to pose, and I wonder if Matthew, if you'd like to take this question, is what is one particular research or learning challenge that you think the pandemic has highlighted? And in speaking about that, you might also like to speak about the highlight, but also the big challenge that's come from the pandemic in terms of the questions of trust and credibility.
Great. Yeah, thanks, Jane, and good afternoon, everybody. Yeah, it's certainly been an interesting time for those of us in the centre and in the audience, no doubt. For the really unprecedented awareness and interest in technology-mediated learning in schools and elsewhere, and teacher education, of course. And interestingly, the very devices that were sort of demonised a few years ago and even banned in schools, the mobile devices, have kind of become critical enablers, of some of the pedagogies that have emerged during the school lockdowns, especially. So, Jane, just to respond to your point here, I'd like to address a research challenge, and specifically in school education, and it revolves around partnerships and trust. To build integrity in any knowledge or associated resources that we generate as researchers, our research in the current pandemic has highlighted the importance of building trust between ourselves and teacher participants in our projects. In our projects, for some time now, we've been very fortunate to enjoy fruitful partnerships with government and non-government schools, both in Australia and overseas. And teachers in our projects often act as co-researchers and also sometimes as co-designers of research-inspired resources. Just for example, the ARC and Erasmus projects you mentioned, Jane, we've been privileged to work with teachers to produce a robust digital pedagogical framework that's underpinned by a socio-cultural perspective. And we've also worked with teachers to produce principles of digital pedagogical innovation, a toolkit for teachers, including validated survey tools, a MOOC and a professional learning app for teachers. So if anyone here tonight is interested in those, I'll share a link in a minute that will lead you to our project website. Just finally, in our current project, examining teachers' digital practices during the pandemic, a critical aspect has again been the development of trustworthy relationships with participants, not just teachers, but also students and school and sector leaders. And at times this has been challenging, especially when we were required to collect data remotely. However, our research has aimed to honour the teachers' voices as well as their students' voices, and I hope that we've achieved that. And hopefully I can introduce this project a bit later, Jane.
Thank you so much, Simon. Really important points that really lead into some really interesting work that Amelia's been doing with her ARC Discovery project, and titled Fostering Global Digital Citizenship. And so just thinking about Matthew's points on trust in young people, and I know that in Amelia's project, she's been working with migrant and refugee young people. So I was hoping you might be able to think about one of those challenges, Amelia, but also one of the highlights from this work that you're doing with colleagues at Deakin University.
Yeah, thank you, Jane, and hello everyone. Thanks for inviting me onto the panel discussion tonight. So you just mentioned my current ARC project. I think one learning challenge that has emerged from that project, and I just dropped the link, or maybe it didn't link, into the chat. It's actually an active project at the moment, and so if there are any teacher educators out there, please go to the project website. We've got a survey that we're currently doing with 13 to 16-year-olds in school, so please share with your classrooms, etc. But one learning challenge that was highlighted by the project, which particularly came about from the pivot to remote learning, was issues around access to learning technologies and equity for students from disadvantaged backgrounds. And this disadvantage was particularly acute for students from refugee families and low socioeconomic backgrounds, where the whole family might have access to one mobile device or one computer, a limited internet or data plan, and yet where that device was expected to be the tool for maybe 3 to 4 young students in the family to do their schooling, perhaps for the parents to do their work as well. So that was a challenge that was met by one school in our study who were lending out Chromebooks to students, of course, but they also had to send home paper and pen work packages for students who weren't able to regularly access Google Classroom from home. And I think what that showed to me was we're still in the midst of a digital divide that is threatening to leave some students behind, at the same time as we're talking about the next step or advances in technology, including AI, to assist learning and literacy. So I think if there's a takeaway of that for me, it's that the benefits of e-learning shouldn't prioritise a sort of techno-solutionist, utopian kind of narrative and ignore inequalities in terms of access and inclusion, and that tech should be designed with the ethics of inclusion and diversity in mind from the outset. So on a more positive story, or an innovation in this pandemic context, I think again from the ARC project, there was one teacher who resisted the school that they were working in. That their school had a no mobile phone policy for learning, which kind of contradicts some of those mobile pedagogies that were discussed before. And he actually resisted that policy to put QR codes onto worksheets sent home so that students could use their mobile phones to open up video explainers on YouTube, or have a learning activity that was engaging and would hook them in and mean that they were on the same playing field, I guess, as the other students. So I think that recognises and challenges a pedagogical aversion to mobile devices as learning devices, which contributes to some of the discussion before. But it also does bring to mind, rather than just questions of credibility and truth, but questions of social justice, of how we can, advance learning technologies, bring them into the classroom, use them to connect with people, in remote learning contexts, but where it is fair and equitable and brings all students into that learning environment.
Thank you, Amelia. Yeah, so critical. And, how does that play out? And, are those ideas of trust and truth really important? And if you can't get on to the internet, or if you don't have access within your own context, then it probably is almost a moot point to some degree. So thank you so much. So Simon Buckingham Shum, so I'd like you to share with us what has been a bit of a learning or perhaps a research challenge that surfaced for you during the pandemic around the issues that we're focusing in on this evening.
Thanks, Jane. Okay, well, a dark cloud and a silver lining. The dark cloud for me is that the pandemic has clearly shown that we are witnessing right now the partial breakdown of societal sense-making. Society is losing the capacity to make sense of complex challenges. Now, this is perhaps not surprising, so much information, but we seem to be seeing the astonishing gullibility of not just young people, of course, but many, many adults, not to be able to trust or discern reliable sources of information, and a complete breakdown in the ability to engage in, rational conversation. And I don't think this is a controversial assertion, but we, the educational sector, need to take some responsibility here. I mean, if we don't share a huge part of ownership of the problem about our citizens' capacity to learn beyond when they step outside of formal education, well, then who does, right? So, if society had done an awesome job and our citizens were engaged in, great discussion and the filtering of resources, well, the education sector would be leaping up and taking credit. But that is not what we're seeing. So the first point is that, the pandemic, and of course, that's just one example, climate change, immigration, any wicked problem where we're struggling to even define the nature of the problem, never mind what might count as a solution. We are struggling as a society. And depending on who you read, that's more or less grim in terms of where our civilization is headed. So that's the dark cloud. It's just been driven home so compellingly over the last couple of years, hasn't it? The silver lining, well, it's also that COVID-19 and that other cryptic alphanumeric COP26, those two terms have also shown us that it is possible for societies to muster the will to learn collectively and change their behavior. Of course, the jury's out what's going to happen with COP26, but we are seeing the ability for people who seem to be stuck in a rut to actually commit and change their behavior. And science hasn't completely lost that, right? I mean, we've all learned so much about epidemiology in the last 2 years, right? And we are seeing signs of hope as well. So depending on how pessimistic or optimistic I'm feeling on a given day, I'm either despairing at our politicians fumbling the future or celebrating the passion of our young people, especially fighting for that future. I believe that technology has some important roles to play, but I'll shut up for the moment. I can talk about those a bit later.
Thank you, Simon. It certainly is a roller coaster, isn't it? And I mean, if you listen to certain news reports or read certain pieces, it's kind of either, the possibilities seem to be sort of meaning that the clouds are lifting, but then it kind of oscillates right into that sort of, I guess, those dark places again. And I think for all of us, it has very much been that sort of roller coaster ride. But I think we want to be sort of upbeat, and so I'm going to continue that this evening. So I wondered if we could just sort of think a little bit more laterally here around critical thinking, credibility, and trust. And so if we go specifically into those particular areas, I just wonder, Matthew, if you could start us our thinking here. And I know that you've done some work with teachers in schools in terms of their responses to the pandemic. And although not directly about trust and credibility, it very much is work that was looking at well-being and learning and student learning. And so I guess you possibly can't even get to those ideas of trust and knowing unless people are well and know how to keep themselves well. So can you just tell us a little bit more now about the work that you've done in those 4 schools that were nominated for their exemplary practices during the 2020 remote teaching period?
Yeah, sure, Jane. And yeah, as Jane mentioned, these were 4 schools with a reputation for exemplary practice. And we focused on actually their 2020 remote teaching practices. And the aim was to investigate digital practices that supported not just their learning, but also inclusion and wellbeing. And a big thank you to the AIS New South Wales for supporting this project, which is still going at the moment. The case schools were from widely diverse contexts, including a range of access to and emphasis on technology. And that was a key point. They were from, very different contexts. There was 2 K-12 urban schools. There were 2 regional schools, one with an outdoor ed philosophy, and 1 specialist school for kids with disabilities, and also for young teenage parents. So huge diversity of context here. If you're interested in this, I'll share the Commission case report in the chat window in a minute, and we're also reporting findings at the AARE conference next week. Needless to say, the 2020 remote teaching period was a catalyst for expedited technology integration in schools. Most schools minimised, or they attempted to minimise, synchronous online teaching where possible, and they tried to increase an emphasis on more independent learning tasks for kids. As a result, there was a wide range of blended and hybrid learning approaches that were really context specific. And I suppose the takeaway message here was there was certainly no one-size-fits-all solution. Most schools' practices aim to enhance student agency. For instance, one school used a minimal number of live Zoom classes, typically as a segue to more self-paced activities that required their use of resources, some non-digital resources, from their take-home learning packs. Teachers also use peer learning activities to support engagement, but also to optimise social interactions for students' wellbeing and try and keep them connected and combat isolation. So hopefully these case studies have generated some evidence-based lessons learned in the wake of the school lockdowns, and will hopefully help illuminate ways forward in these uncertain times. We're currently investigating how teachers refine their practices between this year's school lockdown and last year's school lockdown. And in a separate project, we're collecting ongoing data through the surveys I mentioned before to build a picture of how digital practices may be changing in this emerging landscape. And finally, in another project, we're partnering with Lancaster University in the UK. They're a key technology partner of UTS to investigate distinctive digital pedagogies used by teachers of students with disabilities. Thanks, Jane.
Thanks so much, Simon. Sorry, thank you so much, Matthew. Now, Simon, I'm getting ahead of myself here. I know that you've always been a great proponent of critical thinking and how vital it is. But how do we build that common ground with others? We can't force them into sort of taking reasonable positions and just showing evidence alone. But how do we reach that common ground, do you think, in this space?
Well, I'm a passionate believer in critical thinking, and I've spent a lot of my career building software tools to try and promote critical thinking and argumentation, and that's tools to make visible the structure of arguments, tools that help you critique faulty arguments, the use of AI now here at UTS to show students where they seem to be doing a good job or a less good job in their writing in terms of signaling important argumentative moves. So I love critical thinking, but I think there's a really interesting dance between critical thinking and trust. As with kids, so with adults, you can't engage in deep learning and step out of your comfort zone and engage with people who disagree with you if you don't feel safe. We know that that's the case at school. You know, kids need to feel safe before they're going to take risks. It's the same with adults. So whilst people like me and perhaps many others here are very happy to engage in online debate and critical thinking, even with people that we don't necessarily know so well online, we know that so many others don't have that disposition. They're not interested in you know, potentially reflecting on whether they need to change their view. And all the evidence around conflict resolution, for example, is that we need to build common ground between people. We need to help them see the enemy as humans, as fellow humans, first of all, with much in common, before we can move forward and start perhaps relaxing our defenses, lowering our guard, and potentially considering whether somebody else has actually got something we could learn from. So we're talking about not just critical thinking, but the need to cultivate in our students, whether they're at school or at university, or our citizens at large, more empathic, ethical thinking. I think, you know, that's what builds trust and opens people up to perhaps hearing a critique of their own position. So we are talking about good old multiple intelligences. You know, this is why I love the work of Howard Gardner. You know, his 5 minds for the future crystallizes, you know, a huge amount of scholarship, for example, on how we need to create a more holistic kind of experience for our students. And our own CREDS colleague, Daryl Thompson, who's on the call now, has done so much, for example, to make it practical to assess these kinds of competencies in a practical way in the schools and in university. And we can put some links in about how that actually plays out in practice. So I really think we need to be teaching the next generation how to have those hard conversations. What do you do when you've got an apparently polarized, intractable problem? How do we cultivate that kind of lifelong learning capability? And there are many people working on that problem. If we're not careful, we're going to get ground down in the sludge of school curriculum and assessment reform. We know how fast that moves, but there are many people working on this problem. Business and industry are calling for people with these kinds of competencies. And I think that you know, a key role that a hub like CREDS can play is in working with those pioneer practitioners who have to be very courageous to break ranks, to show how this can be done in schools and in universities, and make these kinds of competencies really core as well, as opposed to soft skills that we somehow try and weave in but aren't really valued in the assessments and so forth. I could talk a lot more, but I should probably pause at that point. But you know, I think that technology has important roles to play in cultivating those kinds of qualities.
Yeah, Simon, I was just wondering if you could talk a little bit more. I know you covered a lot of ground there, but just I'm thinking about the, you know, distinctive contributions that digital tools have made in this space, you know, in terms of the drivers behind social media companies, for example. I mean, is it important, for example, that, you know, journalism builds that common ground? You know, how do teachers navigate that AI space and, you know, increasing demands around assessment? Could you just talk to just for a moment about that? And then I'd like to draw Amelia in terms of her UNESCO project, and then we might open it up to questions from everyone.
Yeah, well, I mean, look, if we just take social media, right, the whole business model driving social media platforms is maximize the time on site, right, which drives you towards algorithms which are going to basically engage in what's been called limbic hijack, right? We need to put material in front of people that elicits the most reactive, most number of responses and tweets and reshares and general energy. That's a race to the bottom. It just happens to be one of the flaws for us as human beings, that we get this, we react to the lowest common denominator stuff, right? we need alternative algorithms and business models that are going to reward more constructive forms of engagement. And those of us in the learning analytics field are busy working on what those kinds of algorithms will be that are going to promote higher order, more constructive engagement with each other. You know, the area of behavioral science and nudging, for some people, is a very bad word, but there are ways of doing that in open and ethical ways that try to nudge people towards engaging in ways that advance the common good and not just self-centered behavior, for example. And we'll be running a workshop on that in a few months, which I can share the link to. So, you know, journalism, I mean, there's been some brilliant work on how you bring together people from opposite sides of the political spectrum to engage, again, in building common ground in order to then have a more civil and reflective conversation. Some fantastic work in the States around that after the last US election. So that's the real passion. You know, we can use technology to provoke deeper reflection and better quality deliberation.
Thanks so much, Simon. Excellent. Look, I just wondered, Amelia, if you'd like to sort of finish this sort of, I guess, our sort of provocations off around your, and share a little bit of your UNESCO project, which is on mapping and a desk review of online resources for LGBTI students and very young, vulnerable young people, because I think it plays into so many of the areas that of using technologies and learning around technologies that we've all been interested in, and some of us for a very long time. So could you just give us a couple of little brushstrokes of that UNESCO project, and we'll follow it up with perhaps a link in the chat.
Sure, thank you, Jane. I can't put the link in, unfortunately. The report's not been published by UNESCO yet, but I'll let you know in turn when it is. But actually, on that UNESCO project, I also just want to call out to Paul Byron, who I think is in the audience, one of the chief investigators on that project. And so just, I guess, broadly, my research is in the space of digital citizenship. Digital citizenship's a really interesting kind of buzzword, and kind of a set of learning resources often are developed in digital citizenship spaces that approach and kind of try and encourage respectful dialogue in terms of accessing online spaces and social media in particular. But I think there's been a massive shift toward, you know, focusing less on, you know, respect, global citizenship, you know, civic kind of discourse, coming from a rights perspective, toward probably a bit more of a negative focus on the harms of digital media and how to protect yourself online, which is, of course, still really important. But some of my research has been interested in trying to, you know, focus much more on some of the civic discourse aspects rather than just digital safety. But coming to the UNESCO project that you just mentioned, it was a project that was funded, a 3-month research project, so a very, very quick one. And the research team was tasked with doing a desk review of digital citizenship and online safety resources for young people in the Asia Pacific region, and to evaluate whether or not they were inclusive of the needs of young LGBTI people across the region. So obviously there was a social justice perspective there of trying to, of seeing whether what existed was addressing the needs of this community. We also interviewed stakeholders who worked with LGBTI youth in a range of countries across the region. One recommendation from the report findings, and hopefully they are published soon, was that the sort of one-size-fits-all and often quite flashy and data-intensive resources that are developed by large, well-resourced NGOs, sometimes partnering with tech companies and governments, are often not very customised or relevant to the local contexts needs and identities of communities who are often disproportionately targeted by online harms like hate speech and misinformation. In this context, we were looking at LGBTI young people in particular, and one of the findings of the report was that stakeholders wanted to see funding and resources go to local civil society groups for them to tap into their own, often, really well-developed networks on social media to develop e-safety resources that are by community and for community, and which are inclusive of local identities, languages, and contexts. So in highlighting these needs, there were two examples from the report that stood out to me, but we might be a bit low on time, so I might just mention one. And one of those examples came from a participant in Mongolia, who claimed that governments and social media companies were often behind the promotion of false or misleading claims about LGBTI communities, and sometimes helped to contribute to hate speech and harassment being directed toward those communities online. Either if it's social media platforms through algorithmic ordering and their business models, or if we're speaking of governments by with LGBTI issues being framed through certain political agendas that questioned LGBTI identities and rights. Therefore, if resources are developed with government, with social media platforms, there was a sense in which they weren't necessarily trusted by community. And that extended to local examples where, for example, it was noted that web searches, again, the participant in Mongolia mentioned this, that web searches hosted by Google or other search engines about LGBTI identities, in that context would often result in the person doing the search finding negative information that would be harmful for LGBTI young people. And this stakeholder said, I just searched about what it is to be gay in Mongolia, and it would always be negative comments or like only gay people have HIV. So we need to fight that misinformation, especially in Mongolia as a small country. So that's just one example, I guess, amongst many that came through in that project, which shows that local LGBTI community leaders and activists, they were themselves often involved in sharing relevant information to community in language and building safe spaces online to address issues of safety, well-being, and also addressing misinformation, which is a huge problem. But they were interested in designing their own resources because they felt that some resources developed by government or big humanitarian organisations, sometimes they didn't feel that it was specifically for them. It wasn't a particularly inclusive design.
Well, thank you so much, Amelia. We really look forward to the report, the big report, I imagine, for that research. So please do share it with us, and we can certainly put that through Twitter and then draw attention to it through our site in conjunction with your work and partnerships. Well, I think that almost we might, in terms of time, I think I need to sort of make a quick dance towards the Q&A now. And I'm just going to pass over the baton to Simon. He possibly has a question that was picked up in the survey prep for this evening. So I'm just wondering, Simon, if you would like to take the reins and perhaps pose the question. I'm not sure to which panel member you'll be addressing that. So let's see.
Yes, thanks, Jane. I'm just trying to find the question again. There've been some reflections on how we build the desire to build independent learning and learners across contexts who can engage with a wide range of material and kind of beyond disciplinary contexts, I guess. How do we do that, particularly in the context of remote learning? And I know this was part of what Matthew was looking at. without increasing risk of social isolation, communities not being able to engage with each other. And of course, what we want is people to be able to engage with each other's ideas as well. I guess what role does technology and the structures we put in place around the use of technology have in supporting learning that does engage people with each other's ideas and with disagreement?
Well, I could jump on that one. To start, I mean, technology does not in any sense make people want to change their disposition, I think. I mean, it's very hard to make somebody want to engage constructively if they really aren't minded to, right? But if people are interested but don't know how, or aren't sure what the norms are, or want to see what it looks like, then we can design better models for collective deliberation and decision making. And when we look at what's going on all over the world now with what are called e-democracy platforms, e-deliberation platforms, they have affordances that promote certain kinds of more respectful, more productive discourse. So, and some brilliant work just down in Melbourne by Tim van Gelder has shown that you can recruit citizens who are interested in working together on complex problems, and they can come out with outstanding analyses that actually are at least as good at it, if not better, than professionals. So the power of collective problem solving, when there's the will to learn and engage, can be harnessed by very well designed technology.
I wonder if we can get a one-line response from Amelia and Matthew, and then we'll wrap up there, I think.
Me first. I would just stress, I suppose, that in my research, the driving interest is in social justice and inclusion. So for tech to be productive in terms of, increasing learning, increasing, respectful dialogue, civic discourse, it needs to always be designed for inclusion and to include a diverse range of perspectives, of viewpoints. And of course, what we're finding, however, is that in some cases, the more voices that are debating a particular issue, we can sometimes get these influences that polarize debate as well, and that can be driven by the platform itself, as the work that Simon has done and a lot of people in the research centre have shown, is that a lot of the social media platforms that we're engaging with in a lot of our research are driven by engagement, connecting people and getting them to engage, and whether that is around respectful dialogue or the opposite, is not of interest to the business model of social media platforms. So so in that sense, it's difficult to say how we will arrive at a place where that can be created, unless the platforms we're involved in, the technologies that we're using, are inclusive by design and ethical by design, and so that is the great challenge.
Yeah, and I think one of the biggest challenges teachers are facing for the next lockdown, whether it's floods or bushfires or another virus-caused lockdown, or perhaps a post-pandemic world, a sort of designing tasks for not just teacher-imposed learning spaces, but learner-generated contexts that teachers may not be able to anticipate, not necessarily at home. So, and how to build these sort of conversations you refer to, Simon, in these, you know, multitude of learning spaces, some of which are learner generated. So I think that's a big challenge for teachers, and some of the tools in that IPAC website can help teachers receive feedback on any tasks they're designing across these sort of new virtual and physical and emerging learning spaces. So if any teachers are here tonight, feel free to use those learning tools to get feedback and generate feedback on things like authentic learning, personalised learning, and certainly conversational aspects of learning.
Brilliant, thank you, Matthew. All right, put myself to the spotlight there. We're going to wrap up there in that case. Thank you again to everybody who is here, all of the attendees. It's really lovely to see both familiar and unfamiliar faces. My thanks to Jane, Amelia, Simon and Matthew for your work on the panel, and all of the centre members for their work including towards this event, and for Noel for kindly situating the centre in the wider UTS context as well. We'll follow up after the event, and I hope that we'll be able to continue these conversations, and please do get in touch if you'd like to keep the discussion going on any of the particular things we've touched on today, or any of the other work of centre members. You'll be able to see what different people are doing and who's in the centre on that website that I've just shared in the chat there, and on our official UTS site as well.